receives the love.
Okay, great. Good evening, and delighted you're all here today because this is a very, very special day for CSOCs, as we have a panel which is composed by two of our former AG Leventis fellows, Eirini and Lamprini, in order of year. Of year being here. Of course, they want to present, and we were delighted to have them here present their joint research that they're doing on anti-Americanism or Americanophilia in Greece. Let me just say that Eirini is now the Associate Professor of Contemporary History and International Relations at the American College of Greece, but she also retains her position at Sheffield University as well. And she has had a number of fellowships in the past. But also she's a principal investigator on a number of projects, including one on global anti-nuclear activism in the 1980s, and one on tourism and mobility. And I have to highly recommend this because she's using a lot of the material from the Olympic Airlines in Greece, and that's a wonderful website that they had created with her team on how it was projecting the image of Greece at the time. And then we've got Lamprini Rori, who is assistant professor in political analysis at the National University of Athens. And Lamprini, before, she was at Exeter University and on a number of fellowships as well. I'm not going to mention them, but she has also done as well, and she's doing a lot of research on online motions and political violence, on hate speech and offline hate crimes. But today she's going to talk about anti-Americanism. And together with us, we have Dimitri Papadimitriou, who's also one of the people that we've worked with in the past, when we keep on working, who's a professor of political science at the University of Manchester. Dimitri is doing his work on EU's external relations, but a lot also on Greece's public policy. And one of the books that he's written together with Kevin Featherstone is about prime ministers in Greece, the paradox of power, which is a very niche kind of thing that nobody has done that particular thing based on interviews and the primary material. And finally, our very own Paul Betts, last but not least, who's a professor of modern European history. We know Paul from his books on Socialism Goes Global, his latest one, The Ruin and Renewal, Civilizing Europe After World War II, and Within Walls, Private Lives in the German Democratic Republic. And Paul is also working in that intersection between culture and politics from a historical perspective in 20th century European history. Eirini and Lamprini will start with 20 minutes each, and then we have our discussants. Eirini, over to you.
Oh, no, Lamprini's going.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So good afternoon. The slideshow. Thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, and thanks to the European Studies Center for the invitation. It's always nice to be back and close to the CSOC family. Thank you, often. So today we'll present some preliminary findings from an ongoing research project related to the evolution of the Greek stances towards the United States in the past 50 years. Sorry. Here.
I think you point to the laptop. Can you move it for her, Julie?
Anyway, I will start by presenting somehow the book outline. So we explore the political and the social evolution of the Greek-United States relations since Greece's transition to democracy in 1974. And this book will approach the complex relationship through multiple analytical perspectives. Our research explores several key dimensions. First, we analyze party elites and public opinion, which is what we are going to present today in the first part of this presentation. Then we examine the role of the Greek-American diaspora as an evolving actor in the bilateral relations between the two countries. Third, we investigate perceptions over time through formal high-level visits, which is what Eirini will present. And then the study explores 5 additional aspects of these relationships. First, episodes of national and international crisis, domestic and international terrorism and how it affects the relationship, civil society perspectives as they are reflected in the commemoration of the 1973 Polytechnic uprising. And finally, we delve into the contemporary dynamics in order to assess the current état de lieu of the Greek stances in the second Trump era. Now, in April 2018, protesters have attempted to vandalize the statue of former President of the United States, Harry Truman. The statue, standing in a central place in downtown Athens, close to the US Embassy, has been vandalized, toppled, and painted over several times, with its feet sawed at least one time since its erection in 1963. Every time, the statue is restored until the next time. The fate of the Harry Truman Monument stands as a constant reminder of the vacillating Greek attitudes towards America and the ebbs and flows of Greek anti-Americanism as a phenomenon in the country's recent political history. The reservoir of anti-American stances since the Second World War is definitely linked to the role of the United States in Greek politics. It increased in the post-74 context, whereas since the end of the Cold War, it has decreased and it presents fluctuations. In this presentation, we focus on the stances and the sentiments towards the US via 2 levels of analysis: the party politics, where the stances are shaped and transformed, but also public opinion, where the sentiment is manifested. 2 research questions underpin the chapters of the book, which pertain to party discourse and public opinion. How does the phenomenon vary over time, and what explains this variation? Anti-Americanism in the international literature is shaped by a coalition of historical, political, economic concerns. Those account for myriad forms and applications across time and space. This is why, according to Katzenstein and Keohane, it is more accurate to speak of the phenomenon in plural, anti-Americanisms, instead of anti-Americanism. In the 19th century, it helped to shift the blame for the problems of modernity away from Europe. And according to Claudke, America became an easy scapegoat for the social and economic upheavals that followed industrialization. In Europe, it is associated with social discontent against modernity, capitalism, and globalization, but it is also reinforced in each country by specific historical traditions of the resentment. In Latin America, it is identified with the left, but also it is positively correlated with stances towards China's economic model. And here as well, important historical dimensions exist and prefigure the ideological strain. In the Arab world, American values and culture are seen as a threat, both a religious and a cultural threat, but here their ideology is Islamism. Now, in most recent years, the rise of populism has updated the framing of anti-Americanism, and it is now not only associated with far-left discourse, but also with far-right parties and policies. It is also positively correlated with conspiratorial views, US-led interventions, and more broadly to the US foreign policy and unilateralism. It is fueled by pro-Russian stances, and it is also positively correlated with negative media content. It is more pronounced in the lower levels of education when you see the individual level data, and with also lower social and economic status. In Greece, the animosity towards the United States is driven by diverse cultural, political, and ideological factors. The different Cyprus crisis episodes in the 50s and the 60s gave rise to a leftist anti-Americanism that developed an anti-imperialist rhetoric. The political discourse of anti-Americanism is centered on Cyprus, on the Turkish threat, but also it is associated with demands for national sovereignty. And another element that captured the Greek anti-American imaginary was the presence of the American bases in Greece. Also, the Greek perception that Americans had facilitated the imposition of the Greek dictatorship and had remained silent during the Turkish invasion. This is what has reinforced anti-American sentiments, with a quest for national dignity at the epicenter. In the post-1974 era, anti-Americanism is also has adopted an anti-right rhetoric, as the right was seen as repressing the post-Civil War system that was associated with American infiltration. Okay. Now, we have three sets of hypotheses. The first pertains to ideology. So we expect that the sentiment towards the United States will be driven by ideology, with far left and far right parties and voters to drive the negative sentiment towards the United States. The second hypothesis refers to the executive. So we believe that parties in government are expected to express a positive sentiment, whereas parties in opposition a negative sentiment. And we also expect that events on the national and the international arena will fuel the sentiment towards the United States. We have used data from party manifestos, parliamentary debates, and public opinion surveys. Regarding the party manifestos, we have used 102 manifestos from 24 political parties from 1974 to 2023. So all of the manifestos that exist, and we have access from the Comparative Manifesto Project. We conducted sentiment analysis and structural topic modeling. In the parliamentary debates, unfortunately, we don't have the Cold War era, so the data starts from 1989, and it is IMED Lab that has digitized the parliamentary debates. So we had access to 1,365,000 speeches. Those are speeches from MPs from the 24 political parties. Again, we conducted sentiment analysis, topic modeling, and we have also run regressions. Now, in public opinion, we didn't have one source, but we had to merge different survey data from the Eurobarometer, from MRP, and from the Dianeosis. Again, we have conducted statistical analysis, and the dependent variable is the attitude towards the United States, and we control for all the variables that we have seen in the theory so far. Now, here is the first graph where you see the preliminary results from party manifestos. On the left, you see the sentiments towards the United States. On the right, you see the salience of the USA topic. We calculated an Americanism score for each manifesto using the difference between the proportion of positive and negative sentences, so that below zero values, which is the horizontal line on the left, indicate anti-Americanism, and above pro-Americanism. The sentiment and the salience of the United States topic are highly correlated. The correlation is 0.94. And this points towards an inversely proportional relationship. So you can imagine that if we fold those two graphs, the two lines would overlap. The evolution of the two measures portrays that the less salient the USA topic becomes in the manifestos over time, the more negativity in the sentiment towards the United States fades away. Then we have broken those data per ideology, or more concretely per party family. So you see 4 lines in each graph, one for the center-left parties, one for the center-right, the far left and the far right. On the left, again, you see the sentiment towards the United States. On the right, the salience on the top of the topic. What we see is that the United States salience and Americanism, they take, again, almost identical forms. We see that there is a variation until the end of the Cold War. Let me see if I can, yes, okay, perfect. No. I cannot point anyway. Here, yes. So here you see that there is a variation until 1990, but then the center right and the center left parties, they are pro-American for the whole period, not very pronounced, but pro-American. Whereas the far left, it's constantly anti-American with fluctuations. And here you see the small, this small line is far right parties. So when the far right parties, they add up after, I think, the mid-2000s, yes, 2008 or something, 2007, anti-Americanism is more pronounced, but this doesn't change a lot in the variation of the phenomenon. Now, on the right, you see again that there is the phenomenon is constant for the salience is constant for center right and center left parties. It's again the far left parties that fuel the phenomenon in party manifestos. Likewise, whenever the USA topic is salient, so is the anti-American sentiment. And this leads us to conclude that it is the anti, instead of the pro stances, that are the main driving force in the manifesto discourse. Here we conducted the topic modeling in the party manifestos. You see the results of the USA distribution between the far left parties in 2 points in time, 1974 on the left and 2004 on the right, because those are the 2 peaks of anti-Americanism. Hence, the events that took place during those years have contributed to the rise of the phenomenon. Unsurprisingly, the most frequent topic in 74 is the invasion of Turkey in Cyprus. The second most frequent topic in 74 refers to the national economic and military sovereignty of Greece. The third is socialism, and the fourth are the NATO bases. In 2004, it is the war in Iraq that figures as the most salient topic. And the most frequent one during this point in time is the opposition of the left towards the EU, NATO, and capitalism. Overall, the United States topic is not salient for most of the parties' manifestos, only for the far left ones. So the anti-American discourse and sentiment is driven by the parties of the far left. It seems also that the United States becomes salient when there is an event related to the US influence, either indirectly or directly, and which leads the far left to form even more pronounced anti-American stances. Here are the results regarding the parliamentary debates. On the left, you see the sentiment towards the United States. On the right, you see the sentiment per party family again. So here we see that as of 1999, from 1989, so the end of Cold War, until 2008, the aggregate sentiment in the parliament is positive, which is a different picture from the party manifestos. And then we see that, again, there is anti-Americanism, which leads the parliamentary debates. Here, when we see fair party ideology, again, the center-right and center-left parties are constantly positive, whereas the far left and the far right parties are, this is the far right, this is the far left, are constantly negative. Here, what we did is that we have aggregated the center left and the center right parties in parliament and the far right and the far left parties. What we see is that the center left and the center right parties, they have the largest US mentions until 2008, the beginning of the financial crisis. Then the center right and the center left parties, they stopped talking about the United States in parliament, whereas far right and far left parties, as of the beginning of the financial crisis, they are all the more talking about the United States in parliament. Okay, here are is the analysis of the topics in parliament. After we have calculated the sentiment, we run a supervised topic model on the US sentences so as to find which topics better explain the sentiment towards the United States. We ended up with those 4 topics that you see on the left. So the first topic is Greece's national defense. The second is the country's international relations with the European Union and the United States. The third are the American bases in Greece. And the fourth is imperialism. So the 3/4, let's say, of the most salient topics, we see that the issues, they pertain to issues realistic about the national and foreign policy of the country. Here are the results of the regression analysis that we conducted in order to see what explains the phenomenon in parliament. So all the coefficients that are on the right of this vertical line explain pro-Americanism, whereas the coefficients on the left explain anti-Americanism. You see that pro-Americanism is driven by discussions about defense, US and EU international relations of the country. It is driven by parties in government. Then the center-right parties, I think, yes, it's not statistically significant. And also we see a positive sentiment in parliament during the IMEA crisis. On the contrary, anti-Americanism is driven by, in discussions about the war in Iraq, the dissolution of the USSR, the bombings in Yugoslavia. It is driven in parliament by far right and far left parties, but also events related to the financial crisis. So the discussions about the referendum, the first memorandum, American bases, anti-imperialist rhetoric, and the economic crisis, the last variable. Now we are turning to the public opinion analysis. Here as well, we only have data as of the 1980s. We see that the images diachronically, we can say that it is negative. So all the observations that we have from survey data are below 0, apart from survey data in 2022, where the public opinion starts to be positive towards the United States. We then tried to compare the elites with the masses, and we see that in the 1980s, the 2 levels of analysis converge. So the public opinion and the party elites, they follow the same direction. In the 1990s, the elites are more positive towards the United States than the masses. In the 2000s, the masses adopt the leftist anti-Americanism of the elites. And in the 2010s, the masses reduce their anti-Americanism without following the parties of the far right and the far left in their anti-Americanism. And for this comparison, apart from the descriptive analysis, we have also conducted statistical analysis in order to see the convergence and the divergence. The voters in general appear to be more anti-American than their parties. We see that those who vote for New Democracy, PASOK, and Syriza are more anti-American than their parties, and those who vote for Kukwe are the ones who are better represented by their parties. So those divergences are nonetheless small, so it's not a big gap that we observe between the voters and the parties. And the second interesting observation is that there is a time lag in the shift of the public opinion compared to the party elites. Finally, we have run a regression in order to see the determinants of the attitudes towards the United States. The first variable that is significant is the self-placement on the left-right axis, but only until 1995. And those who are self-placed on the left, they are anti-American. Those who are self-placed on the right are pro-American. After 1995, this ideological self-placement doesn't explain at all how we feel for the United States. Again, for the vote in the 1980s, we see that there is a high correlation. After 1993, like in the previous variable, this relationship is not statistically significant. There is no correlation until the beginning of the financial crisis, when only for voters of Syriza, we see a constantly positive relationship. So those who vote for Syriza are also anti-American. For Kukwe, only after 2018, and for PASOK, only in 2014. Then we wanted to see the relationship between the stances towards the EU and the stances towards America. Now here there is no correlation at all until the beginning of the financial crisis, and afterwards we see that individuals who are pro-Europeans are also pro-Americans, and those who are anti-Europeans, they're also anti-Americans. Finally, regarding the stances towards the USSR and Russia, we see that the correlation is constantly negative. So those who increase their pro-Russianism decrease their anti-Americanism. So I will now conclude. We saw that there is a variation in the sentiment towards the United States and also in the salience for the United States. In the party manifestos and in the parliamentary debates, we saw different results, which also shows the need for supplementary sources of discourse. In the manifestos, we saw that the less salient the phenomenon, the more the negativity fades away. Anti-Americanism is what drives the manifesto discourse, both in the topic analysis, the topics analysis, and the sentiment analysis. The left is constantly the driving ideology after 1974. After the end of Cold War, though, it's only the far left that is fueling anti-Americanism. We saw that the trauma of 1974 is the matrix of the phenomenon, but it is fueled each time by international events. In the parliamentary debates, we saw that pro-Americanism is more pronounced from the end of the Cold War until the beginning of the financial crisis. And then after the financial crisis, we also, in the parliament, we become more pro-Americans. In 2008, we saw that there is a change in the pattern of the parliamentary debates. So the mentions for the US by the mainstream parties, center right and center left, they drop, whereas the far right and far left parties, they increase their discussions about the United States. What makes anti-Americanism higher during the financial crisis is thus the fact that all the mainstream parties, they stop talking about the United States. And also in the parliament, we saw that The realistic issues of national defense and the international relations of the country are the dominant topics, so those are the ones which give the tone to the pro-Americanism in the parliamentary elite. In public opinion, we saw an enduring negativity, which changes in the beginning of the financial crisis slowly. We saw that this line slowly starts moving in more positive stances, and it becomes positive after 2022. We saw that there is a discrepancy between the sentiment of the parties and their voters. The parties are more pro-American than their voters, and this invites us to try to understand why the parties are more pro-American than public opinion. Is it that the elites de-radicalize the masses? Are the masses restraining the pro-Americanism of the elites? Do the elites fear the electoral losses and the electoral cost? And finally, whether those trends are heavy trends or whether they're irreversible. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks. I'm going to make the change. So I'm going to focus. So this was kind of well, I'm a historian and a political scientist, so clearly this is over my head. But the idea was that we would see the bigger picture, and then we could kind of zoom in specific areas where it would give us more kind of empirical evidence to try to make sense of this phenomenon that we saw through this data. And one of the ways we tried being imaginative was to look, it wasn't that imaginative, but it was thinking about looking at these high-level visits and what they mean, and how the Greeks make sense of it through a different kind of Greek language, which we're going to show you here. Okay, so why static visits? First of all, because they've become commonplace, especially in the post-war period. There have been studies that shows that the American presidential travel has increased small these. And what is most important for our topic is at least that we know for a fact that the visits are kind of a dramatic form of public diplomacy. This is a moment where you get the biggest, kind of most intense media coverage, and it accesses wider audiences. So for us, it's a good case study to get a sense of how and why the Greeks are making, are understanding this relationship as the years go by. And what also we know from the literature is that this kind of state-to-state diplomacy, usually these visits are significant for the kind of less powerful partner because it gives it an opportunity to put its interest and its existence on the map. In one of our interviews, somebody told us Trump doesn't wake up thinking about bliss, doesn't even know at times where it is. So having a visit reminds him of that. That was a slight kind of attempt, but it showcases how vital it's for small countries to kind of gain that kind of exposure in the visit, but also for the partner itself, the stronger one to be able to maintain and kind of further reinforce its objectives, especially the relationship in defense and trade. And thinking about public diplomacy, we go back to this idea, Joseph and I, that in a way, for this to work, though, it has to be credible, it has to involve civil society and kind of endorsement of it. So it's interesting for us to see how much is that the case in the different kind of visits we're going to look at in this chapter of the book. Now, political science studies that look visits as an indicator has looked at different kinds of reasons why they happen. They pose the questions, why do these visits take place? Usually there's this kind of structural approach that has to do about cementing trade, security, strategic relations. The other one has to do with domestic, it's the timing that is led by electoral considerations or by specific leaders wanting to gain specific objectives from countries. And then it's the more practice-based that is part of our diplomatic norms and habits. That's what is expected to be part of the protocol. But in our case, in Greece, there were 18 visits since 1974, which that is an immense increase. If you think that previously there were only 6, and 2 of them were from the royal family, and there was only 1 from American president, which was Eisenhower. So we have analyzed these 18 visits through the, and when I say visits, I mutually talk about the USA presidents visiting Greece and the Greek PMs visiting the United States. And the way we've tried to do it with Lamprini is that we did a media analysis of almost 3,500 press articles through the Greek newspapers, both left and right. We tried to kind of cover the whole political spectrum, and we tried to do the same with what we had at the disposal, which was the American and Greek press. We've done a qualitative analysis and a quant, which you're not going to see today, but it's part of our hopefully analysis we move along. And we've combined that, we've triangulated it with this set of interviews that we've taken up until now, which is up to 31, but we keep on adding them through different kind of academics, politician, and diplomats to get a sense of these different topics, one of them being the visits as well, and what is their effect. So the big question is the question for our chapter, and hopefully for this presentation, try to understand a little bit more is what do the visits tell us actually about what the visits say about the relationship. If you take it, and we've done it one by one, reading through every press clipping, is that you get this kind of four main themes that come across that have to do with symbolic signaling and diplomatic recognition. Just as I said, putting yourself on the map and giving a sense that you're an important ally or that you're still counted diplomatically. There's the issue of policy dialogue and strategic cooperation, which was one of the things that Antony was talking about. How does that translate in terms of defense and procurement and this kind of different economic investment issues? The third one, which is much more interest for us today, is the idea of public diplomacy and how it's perceived domestically, how these visits play out in this relationship. And the fourth that comes up a lot, and we see that in the visit, is the role of the Greek American diaspora. That is a constant theme in all the visits as a kind of it almost acquires a myth how it's going to save the relationship. So it's interesting how it comes across all the visits, but we'll go through some of them. I want to explain there 18, so I'm not going to do that in the next 10 minutes I have. So it's only just in a way, and in correlating with what Lamprini said, in a way, you have this kind of fulcrum, which is the financial crisis. So we can see definitely in the press coverage, I mean now, the press coverage up until 2010 is clearly anti-American across the political spectrum of the newspapers. And I'm going to give you examples of how that plays out. Following 2010, it becomes less anti-American than edging on pro-American coverage of the issue. So you see that these visits in the period before the crisis do not have any kind of impact in how the press is covering the relationship. Either it's successful or not, that visit, the description and kind of coverage is really quite negative. That clearly changes, and I'm telling you in what ways after 2010. And this happens despite the fact that you have an enduring strategic relationship. It just increases over the years, becomes stronger and stronger, but that doesn't seem to be until after 2010. So, and as I said, this has to do, therefore, with this change in the story and how the press becomes more pragmatic and, in a way, sifts along with what the elites have been doing since the 80s and the 90s. They can kind of catch up, and we explain how that happens. Now, so 74, Eirini mentioned already, you have that huge trauma of Cyprus that kind of ignites. Already we have ideas of anti-Americanism in the country since the 50s. Then the hood that comes, there's this idea of culpability. And then, of course, Cyprus hits, which completely dominates the political culture, that this is their fault. This has to do with Kissinger and his inactions. So what you have, and what is interesting in terms of anti-Americanism, is that you have the first conservative government of Konstantinos Karamanlis does the most anti-American act, which is taking the country out of the military with NATO. He explains it in terms of the fact that he's pressed domestically, but the fact that he's doing it. And through the interviews, it seems that Moligat is one of his main advisors. They are quite anti-American. They're skeptical. They don't believe that the Americans will come and save them. So this is not just an action for domestic gains. It seems that actually it's showcasing this disbelief in your ally that they're not going to support you, actually they're going to support your enemy. It's the case is Turkey. And at the same time, this is interesting in 74, why this kind of a turning moment is also about this myth of the Greek lobby, because it suddenly becomes politicized. You have this big community in the States now having a say, and actually being anti-American themselves, which was such a turning point from what they were before. And then, of course, you have the Papadimitriou years where you go from, we have no visits, so there's nothing here to report. But what we do have is that we go from this kind of societal anti-Americanism to actually a government-embedded kind of anti-Americanism, where it completely dominates and it becomes acceptable politically and electorally, makes a huge gains to adopt this policy. This why strategic relationship deepens. We renew the base agreements. We open up for economic investments. The country is open, and despite what Thomas Miller, the diplomat, says, that we had a really schizophrenic relationship in the 1980s. And then started the first visit. July 1981, part of his European tour, George Bush comes to Greece. He's the first president after Eisenhower in 59. And the expectation is that this is now the first openly pro-American government coming in. And you would expect that because of this, the coverage will start being better. So what you have is there's this idea of a new era. So all of the newspapers talks about this new chapter in the relationship. And the new chapter is because you have someone like Mitsotakis, in power, being pro-American. But the reality very quickly becomes is that this kind of new era concept becomes really quickly a disillusionment, because the way the press is depicting it is, again, it's a quite anti-American point of view, and I'll explain here if you see. So Tobima says the excessive pro-Turkish orientation of American policy has been the main cause of friction in bilateral relations with Greece and the United States. Already, and this belief and the idea that the Americans are pro-Turks and are against our own wishes and interests, or Tanea saying our great friend will leave us stranded once more, or Greece never had the opportunity to forget its transatlantic ally. First the military dictatorship, then Cyprus were reminders that words and acts are always existent, and gives you that sense of the coverage of the visit at the time. And then following again the same idea, 5 months later, he's invited to the White House again. Mitsotakis plays this up. This is a great moment for the country. We are a regionally important player. It affirms our geopolitical relevance. The idea is that we are part of this asymmetrical relationship between Athens, Ankara, and Washington. In other words, they're going to screw us all over again. We cannot trust them. In fact, they are only favoring Turkey. And this is just indicative of the coverage, which is incessantly the same kind of themes being discussed again and again. And you move forward, and you go from just not only the Greek-Turkish issues that we know, and the Cyprus, which are constant themes in every visit in the relationship, and you have the issue of Macedonia compounding the whole kind of problem. And what is interesting to see here is also you have the conservative, center-right newspapers talking about a strong strand of anti-Hellenism within the American State Department or the White House. The idea is that they are targeting us, they are against us, they're not going to promote any of our interests, they don't understand where our policy is coming from. And that cuts across all the different kinds of political leanings and coverage of the newspapers. And then as you move on, you have Clinton's 99 visit, which is the most reported visit in the whole of the press. The reason partly was that because of the intense protest, his visits was delayed for several days. So the press had a field day reporting on how the protests were so capable of stopping the president from coming in the country. But it does say a lot about the fact that you have now quite a charm offensive from Clinton. He comes, he apologizes for the role of the United States in the junta. Supposedly the parliament is overtaken by this stark acknowledgement of their culpability. That does not do anything in the press. The opposite, they don't trust that kind of, they don't take it at face value. And what is worse, they see this as a part of greater, imperialist tendency of the United States that is exemplified by the Kosovo bombings at the same time. So this kind of different kind, again, of things that get convoluted, then you get this kind of a dichotomy between what the elites are trying to promote as a successful visit, that national interests are being promoted, what is happening actually on the streets, and how the press, kind of reports on this, feeding the public opinion with specific kind of framings of indignation and kind of disappointment, disillusionment with what they're going to do. And you see that, and how even the foreign press, how they talk about the anti-American protests. You see the kind of intensity. They're running street battles with the riot police, leaving Athens main square devastated. Or the Chicago Tribune compared the clampdown to what was happening in communist nations when they were hosting American leaders. And then you go to 2010, and then the rhetoric, and then what I'm moving over the 2000s, because it's exact same kind of coverage, with the only difference that we are turning more pro-European, and therefore in the 2000s you see, for example, a Semitis that is much more confident in playing the European card, but still very much depending on the Americans for different kinds of national interest. But in 2010 now, when Papadimitriou visits Obama, that we're just on the cusp of the first memorandum, is that you have now a coverage that we are moving from the Americans in a way being the bad guys to the Europeans being much more pressuring. So even Eirini starts to kind of covering this, talks about how we move from, as the quote says, from the European partners being unhappy to actually now the Americans acting as a source of support, which is exactly the kind of the catchword that you see across the coverage, that the Americans now are here to support us again and again in this trying time. And that becomes, therefore, as we move along, and then Obama visits in 2016, again, Trump has won over, so at that point, the discussion is what will happen the next day. But it's interesting during this visit that you have, again, the coverage is much less anti-American, and the context, therefore, is very specific, because they are covering how during this crisis is they're naming the Treasury, they're naming members of the USA administration, how they're coming in and publicly talking in favor of against Brexit at the time, and trying to showcase kind of the sacrifices of the Greek people. And that, in a way, becomes even more intense, the fact that you have Tsipra's government who won on the anti-American platform and the European platform, turning very much pro-American in its policy. That doesn't mean that you stop having that kind of anti-American coverage, but it lessens across the board and becomes much more about support than actual accusation of various sorts. And that goes back to the idea that, in 1999 and 2016, Obama and Clinton used the same kind of phrase to introduce themselves to the Greek people, that we're all Greeks. And, it doesn't work in 1999. It works in 2016. That has nothing to do with their personalities. It's the context that changes everything, and why they're much more reciprocal in this kind of rhetoric, and why it's been actually reproduced in a much more positive way in the Greek press, the same kind of quote that you see it in the different kind of eras. And this kind of pragmatism that starts to dominate the press completely takes a strong form when Mitsotakis wins, and he has his first visit with Trump in 2020. What happens now? There's a change. Not only we're anti-American, but being pro-American means that we're moving out of our small regional ethnic problems, and we're becoming part of the solution and not part of the problem. So the idea is that Greece, and what I'm talking about the press coverage now, in a way rediscovers that Greece could be of use, and we shouldn't be complaining anymore, but we can be part of the solution. And it is picked up by the foreign press as well, who is very eager to capitalize on this. And this pragmatism, of course, has to do with the fact that not only the financial crisis has gone by, which has well, first of all, I think the society is more mature and the press is more ready to be more pragmatic, to be able to answer to this kind of big questions about where the foreign policy interest lies. But it also has to do that by 2010, what you have geopolitical as well is that because of Turkey's actions, Greece sees an opening to be able to be more geostrategically important for the United States. Therefore, the rhetoric becomes much more about pragmatic solutions and about how there can be on equal footing the relationship because Greece can give something because of where it stands in Eastern Mediterranean. And that is exemplified completely by the address of Mitsotakis at the joint session of the USA Congress. If you ask in all of the interviews, the assessment is that this is the apology of Americanism. It's unprecedented success. We've now completely pro-American. And the reality is that the Greeks are employing this much more kind of as American terminology that the Americans could understand. So it's much more less about what Turkey does to us and much more about how we can contribute to the geopolitical stability of Eastern Mediterranean and of the Middle East and Europe. But most importantly here is that what happens is that what you have an alignment between the pragmatism that you already saw in the political elites from the 80s, from the late 1980s and early 90s, now being really kind of echoed in the press coverage as well. The press now is covering about the successes. It's talking about the trade-offs. This is much less emotive and much more about real politics than anything else. So trying to conclude and trying to see and how we, with Lamprini, we will be able, I don't know how that can be done, trying to connect the dots and the data that have been analyzed together and with all these kind of thematics that we're going to look at, is try to understand, first of all, what really seems to be changing is this 2010 cutoff. How does it look like and why is it so important? In a way, we know, we can understand the kind of main idea behind it, but we want to see exactly how it manifests itself in different kind of ways. And visits gives you a snapshot of these ideas, but it doesn't give you the whole picture. Because in the case of post 2010, we only have we have 2 visits. And then, of course, it kind of makes us think about the fact that you have more successful visits only happens when there starts to be a shift in public opinion. They're considered really successful when the public has also turned pro-American and the press coverage is really kind of embracing these ideas and this kind of they're completely aligned between what the elites are propagating is happening in these visits and what the press is covering for the public. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Can I suggest that we have 15 minutes so that we can also have input from the audience as well? Let's start with Paul and then we finish with Dimitri.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I must say it's great to have both of you back in the building. It's been a long time, so it's a great pleasure for us to have you back. So I was just going to essentially give a kind of set of reflections and some questions of clarification, mostly at the very, very end. I thought it was a really nice kind of double act, which kind of blends international relations and history. I'll concentrate more on the history side, more on Eirini's presentation, if that's okay. I mean, it seems like both ways, it's a kind of important idea of the kind of role the state visits as kind of indications of bilateral relations, but also you're smuggling into kind of trilateral relations. That Turkey plays a very, very important role in the kind of effort on the part of Greece to compete with Turkey for diplomatic attention for the United States. I think you're right to direct our attention back to state visits as a kind of political and cultural form, as kind of interstate relations. Now, the role of kind of formalized diplomacy, embassies, of course, goes back a long way, back to 13th century Italy, Italian city-states, in the idea this is designed for kind of knowledge gathering and peaceful relations. It becomes, with time, an important feature of these kind of public diplomacy venues, an important feature of 19th century state formation and the construction of the international system itself. Now, it's really the 20th century, though, that makes this a much more popular form, thanks to modern technology, also air travel. It makes summitry in that way actually very, very common. So in that way, 1945 to 1989 is kind of golden age of these kind of diplomatic summitry and state visits. Reminds me of the book by David Reynolds, which I don't think you've cited the paper on, called Summits, 6 Meetings That Shaped the 20th Century. Again, it's very Eurocentric, very superpower centric. He's looking at the meetings, let's say, Roosevelt, Stalin, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Nixon, Sadat, Carter, as a way of talking about how the 20th century evolved through these key meetings in those particular instances. And of course, overshadowing this is, of course, the failed diplomatic venture on Chamberlain's into Germany in 1938. So these are, in a sense, more successful diplomatic encounters as opposed to what happened in 1938. So the 20th century in that way is one in which these diplomatic summits, these state visits are not limited, of course, to superpowers and become very, very common. It becomes a place, a kind of interface of state leaders for domestic and political policies. And I should say, incidentally, when I was involved in the Socialism Global Project, we were looking at the relationship in Eastern Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The role of these state visits became very, very important in that story, and since it became encounters between what we then called the Second World and the Third World. It became particularly interesting because these are often bringing together leaders from areas of the world that had very, very little to do with each other historically. For example, Poland and Ghana, or Romania and Algeria, or the GDR in Tanzania. So these weren't just state visits; they're often almost anthropological encounters. So that becomes actually quite important. And Tito was a real master in the sense understanding the importance of this kind of peripatetic world diplomacy. He was the first communist leader to go to Latin America, first communist leader to go to sub-Saharan Africa, understood the importance of winning over friends and influence. And interestingly, he never traveled by plane until Stalin's death, but for fear that the Soviets would shoot down his planes. Always traveled on his beloved Galud cruise liner until 1953. So he becomes a kind of marker of a new kind of very energetic state leader on the world stage. So when we think of U.S.-Greek relations, I think these are very, very important story of kind of international diplomacy, how the trade or the interaction mirrors wider political issues. You talk about the different U.S. visits. I was struck by the fact that why there was not a U.S. presidential visit from 1959 to 1991. That's a long time. I mean, I just kind of wonder if you have any reflections on why that gap between, I think it was Eisenhower, I guess, and Bush in 1991, and why the traffic was essentially from Greece to the U.S. almost exclusively. And then there's a U.S. interest in a sense, establishing more of a diplomatic beachhead on the kind of eastern flank of the West, in a sense, more after the Cold War than it was during the Cold War, despite Truman's constant sense of Greece as being a key member of the kind of NATO flank of the West. Just a few questions then, which is, I think, partly, as Lamprini had mentioned a little bit, I'm just kind of curious about the role of the left-wing press in terms of if there are particular patterns, what kind of influence did they have? And one thing in terms of, as a corollary to the importance of state visits, it's also something I've worked on about 15 years ago, the role of state funerals. Because these become also a kind of, they are state-sponsored events, but it becomes also important. You can kind of get some sense of public interest. The state funerals, for example, for Churchill or de Gaulle were huge outpourings for Tito, for that matter. Much less so for Walter Ulbricht when he died in 1973. And it gives you some indication of the kind of public affection, the public love for these characters, or not. And I was thinking of, let's say, the Truman funeral, 1972. Does that play out in the Greek press? Is that a moment? Or let's say Papadimitriou's death in 1996. Is there a U.S. interest and reception of that particular, or Reagan's own death in 2004? In other words, this kind of Greek-U.S. relations, do they play out also in important moments of state funerals? Another issue is also the role of culture in these relations. I mean, battles over the Elgin marbles, or lots of other ways, study trips, U.S. archaeology teams. I mean, there are lots of ways in which the U.S. Greeks are tied together. I mean, again, it's always the backdrop of the Parthenon and the idea of we are all Greeks. But there are also lots of ways in which civil society is mapping these out in very different ways, including the role of churches. And I'm just wondering how important you think that is. What you present to us is a very, very secular story. One image of someone from the church, but also efforts to build kind of Christian solidarity across the oceans in terms of thinking about Greece and the U.S. in this way. One thing also I think is quite important, I was going to say, is I have two more points here. This last one about the changing role of these state visits. I think we've all been witness to the kind of horror of Trump's dressing down of Zelensky and Ramaphosa, who had clearly understood what was happening, what was coming. But it does, I think, suggest that the state visit itself has become a different form, where before was a very slightly banal, orchestrated event for this cameras, a couple handshakes, and then the action took place behind closed door, and then they would come out at the end and announce what they had achieved. Trump, in a sense, says, it's all on camera, but it's an effort not as a kind of gesture of reconciliation or of amity, but one actually of exposing the conflict as opposed to addressing the conflict. And I just wonder, in a kind of media-saturated age, if this becomes a possible form of the state visits, what you're describing as a kind of historical anomaly, it's a kind of a 20th century form, which had gone very wrong in 1938, the Chamberlain's visit to Germany, and then Trump, his hosting, if I want to call it that, of Zelensky, in a sense, is kind of a bookends of the beginning and end of a certain kind of, what do you want to call it, kind of civilized diplomacy, in which it's really about conversation, dialogue, and exchange of views, as opposed to a public dressing down, exploiting power relations in what's become the kind of classic gesture of the Trump White House. The last thing I'll say, which is, I think it's percolating in both of your presentation, which is quite important, is what do you actually mean by America? Right? I mean, it's a difference to me if you're desecrating the Truman statue, that's one thing. If you're attacking the American military installation in Athens, that's another thing. Or if you're protesting in front of McDonald's, that's another thing. These stand for different Americas. There's a kind of, is anti-Americanism then about the U.S. as a hyperpower, as in a sense an imperial hegemon? Is it the U.S. as a disappointing partner? Is it the U.S. as a kind of as a promoter of neoliberalism? So what is it that's driving that American or that anti-Americanism? It's a different America for different people, but it's also an America that's changing form depending on the audience and the people that are anti-Americans. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, but I found it really, really rich. I especially like the idea of thinking about the cultural form of the state visit, but also a way of rethinking U.S.-Greek interactions from a different perspective.
No, thanks, Paul. It's funny because when you were talking about the changing nature of state visits, and Eirini had that photograph with Mitsotakis and Trump during the first presidency, and I was watching at this chair, which has now become the yellow chair, that has become like an electric chair for the host. You never know what kind of surprise is going to spring, from this one. Yeah, Dimitri.
Well, thanks.
7 minutes, and then we can go.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and keep it brief. Thank you for sending us the material to read. It's a fascinating project. It's an interdisciplinary project, and with it comes challenges, of course. But this is the kind of rethinking of the history of U.S.-Greek relations that the bibliography needs. I think that it's good time for another book on Greek-American relations to come out. And my comments will focus primarily on the book as a standalone project, as opposed to the individual material that we have received. And to me, as a book, your project seems to have an inbuilt tension in a way. On one hand, if you look at the book outline and the chapters that you want to look at, great coverage, spanning over 50 years, so big topic, covering parliamentary debates, public opinion, governments, and so on. So huge coverage, and there is a lot of wealth and a lot of value in this, which is great. But on the other hand, trying to look at this huge, vast field through the rigor of hypothesis and sort of a more formal research design. Both very, very useful in their own right, but can they be combined? I'm not sure. And I was thinking, as I was reading the both pieces of work, perhaps Lamprini's presentation on public opinion trends, on sentiments and so on, would that be a fantastic chapter 1 in a book that looks at various aspects of Greek-American relations over 50 years? So in the sense, it becomes background, it becomes a scene setter, which is of course very, very rich and extremely useful. Or do you use these hypotheses, the 3 hypotheses you have there, to then relate each of these chapters to it? And the latter seems to be a very big challenge, because if you look at your sort of research questions that Lamprini's presentation, there are also some research questions relating to Eirini's individual chapter, but the overarching questions are tracing the contours of this relationship. That's a more descriptive undertaking. Excellent, it's very good. And then what explains it? Now, the causalities here can become a minefield, right? Because in each of these chapters, you might be needing different types of data sets. You might need additional data sets, or perhaps the data sets you have may not be enough to cover them all. So this is the tension. I don't know which way it can go. I think if it goes down the hypothesis testing route, it needs a very careful consideration on how you relate these chapters to it and properly address them. And again, the problem you might have here is that, as Lamprini mentioned, there is a data set that covers all party manifestos from 1974. That's great. But for parliamentary debates, we have data from the 90s onwards, for public opinion from the 80s onwards. So again, we don't have, people who deal with data set like precision and comparability. I don't know how you overcome this. I'm not working with these big data sets usually, but I can see a challenge there, and I'm not entirely sure. So instinctively, I would probably go for coverage and the innovation of the various aspects of it, rather than with a very formal rigid research design that then addresses all of these topics. With regards to the hypotheses themselves, I think if you don't mind moving one, or two slides forward, I think there are some possible difficulties here. I think that in one of your hypotheses, you seem to assume that the parties in opposition will be more anti-American than those parties in government. But I don't see why. I mean, in fact, I can think of the center-right in Greece in the 1980s, which electorally capitalized on its pro-Americanism and accused the center-left of isolating the country. So electorally, it's not always true that if you are in opposition, you would have to be more anti-American. New Democracy from 2015 to 2019 was not more anti-American than Syriza, right? Reversely, it may also be true that being anti-American while in government is an election winner. Again, the experience of the 1980s with PASOK, the early years, of course, tells us that PASOK's anti-Americanism was electorally a gift from God, right? It was, it matched public opinion, skepticism, and so on. It was not detrimental. So I think the assumption behind your second hypothesis, that the parties in opposition are always more anti-American, is not, it needs some rethinking. In the same way, I think that your first hypothesis that anti-Americanism is informed by ideology is not always true. Because if the first hypothesis is true, that it's ideology that determines anti-Americanism, then the second hypothesis cannot be true, which is that parties change their stance once they are in opposition or in government. Because assuming they have the same ideological predisposition or disposition, then you wouldn't expect both hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 to be right. Sorry, I know it's late in the afternoon to be talking about hypothesis, but I think it's a useful way of thinking of how we can frame this. And again, your third hypothesis about international relations matter in this relationship. Who can argue against this? How can you disprove this? Of course they matter. So the question then becomes which ones matter the most and why, right? So again, I think that there is some thinking to be done there. As you were presenting your data, and now I'm trying to bring the two presentations together, to me, the more interesting puzzle behind all of this is not why a left-wing party in the 70s was anti-American after Greece has lost the war. Is not so much why the Communist Party is against the US. The really interesting part for me is why in the late 2000s, where there is no major war, there's nothing interesting happening more broadly, anti-American sentiment in Greece increases. And why is it that the center-right, that the far-right in Greece sees an opportunity there? It's the first time that the right in Greece, either the center-right or the far-right, becomes anti-American, sees anti-Americanism as an election winner. So to me, that's very interesting. It coincides with Laos entering, a populist right-wing party for the first time entering parliament in 2007. So why is that the case? I don't have an answer, but I would have loved to read something about this, which is, again, speaks to much bigger literatures beyond Greece, which is why the populist right across the United States, across Europe, had developed an anti-Americanism until recently. And what will happen to this right-wing populism now that Trump is in power and he's supporting them? So again, there are some very interesting connections to be made there that I think is worth considering. I thought that the Eirini chapter.
1 minute.
1 minute. Eirini chapter was it's very interesting. I think you've underplayed the significance of Andreas Papandreou's visit to the US in 1994, where there was a huge drama back in Greece. Will he be strong enough to fly? May he die as he goes there, because he was in his last legs. But to him, it seemed to have been a very important visit. Remember that Papandreou had lost his American citizenship, or he had renounced it himself in the 1960s. That was the first time that a center-left Prime Minister of Greece visited the White House. Hugely significant, symbolic, and of course, the beginning of a process that eventually leads to Clinton apologizing for the dictatorship in 1999. So I think it's an important part. Finally, the interesting thing, and I'm just touching upon something that Paul mentioned earlier, in Eirini's chapter and in her presentation, you read a lot about how public state visits of that type can be unblocking events, hugely significant events. But there is also a very sneaky reverse image here, which is some of the really important agreements between Greece and the United States in the 80s, but also in the 90s, were never followed or acknowledged in a state visit. What do I mean by this? When Greece and the United States agreed to renew the lease for the American bases in Greece in the 1980s, hugely controversial public opinion at that time. The agreement was never done between at the highest level. It was done by ministers and swept under the carpet. Similarly, when the Greek Prime Minister thanked the Americans for avoiding a war with Turkey in 1996, hell broke loose in Greece. How dare the Greek Prime Minister acknowledging the support of the United States? So it might be that sometimes state visits can be counterproductive in dealing with some of these controversial issues in the face of hostile public opinion. So I'll finish.
Thank you very much. This is because we don't have enough time for tomorrow. So I suggest that we collect as much as we can from our audience, and then you can write down if there are any responses that you need to put to all these points. Okay, you have to be selective. Good. So, plenty of hands. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating.
I think introduce yourself so that they write down.
Sorry, my name is Mehdi Askarieh. I'm a Science and Technology Director at Harvard. Very interesting presentations, as I said. I'm not going to make it complicated. My question is not about what you present, but it's about what you haven't presented, which is the period before 1974. That's the period of the military junta and the support of the Americans. Of the junta is really the peak period of anti-American sentiment in Greece. The only mention that you did make of that period was in 1973 Polytechnic uprising. But prior to that, during the reign of Papadimitriou, of colonels, of the Kapodistrian, etc., is the period. I'm not quite sure what rationale that you've used to somehow overlook that period in your work.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, Timothy Gardner.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much. Fascinating presentation. Really interesting. I'm great that you're trying to be interdisciplinary, but I thought I detected a certain tension between at least one conclusion from political science and history, because in Lamprini's slide, it said, I took photograph, stances towards the EU, 1980 to 2007, no correlation. Post 2008, stances towards EU and USA follow the same direction. But unless I've misunderstood, what Eirini was saying was almost the opposite, that there's an inverse correlation, that because of the resentment of the EU stance in the Eurozone crisis, there was more support for the US. So that's an inverse correlation. So there does, at least at first glance, seem to be a certain contradiction between those two. So question number one is, which is it? But question number two is, if there's an inverse correlation, as Eirini suggested, i.e. EU unpopular, US becomes correspondingly more popular, is there not also the other inverse correlation, which I would expect under a Trump presidency, but also at the time of the Iraq War, US policy very unpopular, EU becomes more popular.
Thank you so much. My name is Kira. I'm a postdoc in the politics department. And I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm very impressed by this super rich kind of multi kind of methods research. I think would be really useful, and many social scientists would be interested to use this data. I am kind of following up on also Dimitri's comments and kind of Tim's question. I wonder if you're capturing kind of with this kind of shifting moment around 2007 to 2010, somewhere there. I wonder if what you're capturing something about the changing cleavage structure of Greek politics. So I'm wondering if kind of anti-Americanism is mostly a left-right correlate in the pre-financial crisis period. And because kind of we know that left-wing language is very dominant in Greek public discourse during that time, anti-Americanism is also very dominant. Even if what Lamprini said is correct, and then kind of you start seeing that anti-Americanism starts correlating with sentiment towards the EU, and it starts capturing something more about what people think about international economic integration, the EU, globalization. So kind of this new kind of cleavage starts permeating and kind of, being a driver of public opinion in Greece, and kind of anti-Americanism shifts and starts capturing that. And that might explain kind of why we also get a strong pro-American lobby in Greek public today, because you do have a very kind of strong support of international economic integration, the EU, etc., during the period of the crisis in Greece. So I'm wondering, basically, like the debate stops being so much about left and right in the traditional sense, and it starts being more about kind of stances to international economic integration, which would also explain kind of what Dimitri pointed out, which is why kind of far right sees an opportunity and picks this topic up. So I don't think you can formally test that in the book, but perhaps it's a way of thinking about what's happening.
Thank you very much. I can take the anti-Americanism as a novel to be studied in the plural very, very interesting. And that's why when you listed and explored what events might relate to anti-Americanism as markers in the elite part of your study, I was expecting kind of the same to be done in terms of the public sentiment. So I was wondering whether you have thought of when you study the alignment or misalignment between elites and the public, whether you might be talking about different things when the idea of anti-Americanism comes up.
Okay, let's pause here because you need to kind of respond a little bit. You had a lot of input here. So if you want to start addressing from Paul, okay?
Okay.
That's what you're here for.
That's true. And thanks for the comments and for taking the time, Dimitri and Paul, to read the work. Really appreciate it. Paul, you're right in everything you said. First of all, I did think about here visits because I was thinking about how when the Soviet leaders were dying one after the other in the 1980s, they couldn't find a leader to actually converse with, to discuss these issues, and it goes to this idea of who you are talking to and how these things, what do these occasions offer? So that was what I was a historian trying to understand. What do they offer in us understanding a relationship that is complicated? And then comes a visit, which you could say it's completely, it's according to protocol. I have the capacity to provide it to really change. Really, everything is predetermined. But the fact is that it has this culture underpinning that it becomes actually very, very interesting. Now, there are all these things that you said that I wanted I would want as a historian to look at, but they were out of the ambit of the book. And talking with a political scientist, he was saying that's not interesting book. That does not tell us anything about the Greek society. So in a way, what we were trying to do with the visits, it's try to see, first of all, if they are changing and their role, and I think they are. In the case of Greek-American relations, they become much more substantial and specific about the gains and benefits. You see, after 2020, after 2015, 2016, when Greece is slowly moving out of the crisis, and we are kind of repositioning ourselves as a power where we stand, especially geopolitically. I think these visits become an opportunity to realign ourselves, the Greeks, in a different way. And I think the Americans are kind of reciprocating this kind of approach. And you see, and these state visits therefore become that interesting kind of have this different kind of functionality where they reaffirm this kind of realignment, but it gives the specific markers of what it looks like, which you didn't have at all. It's much more simple rhetoric. Now, in terms of what was the role of the church, the role of the church is only mentioned in what to do with the role of the Greek American church and the role of the Archbishop becoming kind of a political figure, politicized figure in cementing the relationship. So that's where in the Greek press, the issue of religion comes much more forward. How can the Greek Orthodox becomes a force that can embolden the Greek American diaspora, and that in turn will make the case will promote the Greek Americanism much more. I think there is an issue of Christian solidarity, but it doesn't come across in the Greek press at all. It's only the foreign that you see some kind of notion to that. In the Greek press, that is not, at least I had seen anything according to that. And then instead of thinking about how these visits are going to be play out, I mean, all bets are off now because there's no protocol. That's the idea. We've moved on from this kind of diplomatic norm where everything was pre-calculated and expected to not knowing when is exactly going to happen. So it is a different era. Also, if we're looking at this visit, it's interesting for us also to look at the different international context and how that changes. Every time you look at these visits, what seems to be more important than the dynamics of the relationship is what is happening in the world at the same time. So in 1991, when Bush comes to Greece, there is this idea that the world is changing, but Greece is not picking that up. When the wall fell down in 1999, Greece did not report on it, only for 2 days later. This was not an issue. We were not interested in international events. We're interested in what is happening with Turkey, what is happening with our regional partners. So it gives you a sense of how ethnocentric it is. And that completely changes. And that's where the external environment becomes much important. And then just to answer the question why we're not looking pre-74, I'm trying to pick up some from I can say more questions. First of all, because we had to pick for the objective of the book, we had to pick a period of democratization. So we covered the 74 era afterwards. But you're right, the junta period and the activities and the inactions or support of the United States are featured throughout. So what is interesting is not what exactly happened during the junta, but it's how it's memorialized and negotiated as a trauma in the post-74 era. And that's exactly what we're doing. So we're always revisiting it, but not by focusing on what exactly happened, which historians have looked at now, but that's more about how the society reflects on it in very much deflected lens, because what they're saying is not exactly what happened. So I think for us, it will be more interesting accepting the weight of that event and how important it is, like you said, in cementing the anti-American sentiment, actually taking that approach of seeing how it's being remembered and used and abused in some ways. And finally, with the Papadimitriou visit being the more dramatic, you're right. It's not depicted that way in the Greek press. It's dramatic in terms of if he's going to make it, but it seems more that now what happens, what's interesting, this kind of syndrome we have of being always neglected or not kind of treated as we should, is that Papadimitriou says, especially the pro-party, pro-governmental newspapers at the time reporting, see this as the moment of vindication for Papadimitriou going there. Is he vindicated for what? For being anti-American all this time and now getting an invite in 1994? But the way this is, that's the sentiment that runs throughout the press, that he's finally vindicated. Therefore, the Greek position is that being anti-American has proven highly successful because it gets you at the White House and there you can negotiate. So it's this lunacy of this argument that seems to be percolating in that at least visit, as much as I can remember. I think I've covered most of the things that pertain to my.
Can I just point something to what Eirini said? Because the 1974 moment is not just because there is a fall of a dictatorship and at the beginning of a democracy. It is really a cutoff point because you've got, in a way, two anti-Americanisms developing beyond that point. That's why it's important what Paul said. You need to define what anti-Americanism is, because it's not at everybody's mind the same thing. On the one hand, you have the legacy of what America was before 1974, and Greece, a client state, and at the same time, that anti-imperialistic attitude, which is very much part of the far left and the left-wing parties. On the other hand, 74 is a cutoff point because there is this Turkish dimension that comes into this. And that is more of the nationalist orientation of the far-right parties. it's very important not to kind of confound all the parties of the opposition together or all the extreme parties together, because it's a very big. I doubt whether November 17, and David remembers that very well, had its mind on Turkey and Cyprus. It was more about that kind of imperialistic domination of the United States that, so it is very important to define what anti-Americanism is, I believe.
Thank you very much. Great comments as always here, and thank you very much for the feedback. We need to think a lot about the points that you have raised, Dimitri, about the book structure and how to proceed with the analysis. I don't have many answers regarding your points at this stage. It's true that if we follow a proper research design with hypotheses, then it has to be consistent throughout the chapters, and this might be very difficult, especially because we are using so different methodologies in the chapter. So you cannot test hypotheses with press data, which are collected in specific points in time, and then when you have public opinion data and parliamentary debates and manifestos throughout the whole period. And again, as you mentioned, one of the problems is that we don't have data for the whole period, and this is something that we cannot rectify, and especially because we lose all the first period of the Cold War context, which is important. So we don't really know exactly what happens in the parliamentary debate throughout this period, and it's difficult to test hypotheses. Having said that, I will try to reflect on some of the points. First of all, the left press, as you asked, Paul, I think that the left press is constantly anti-American, but this is not, to me, the most interesting part when in the analysis of the press. It is that also the center left and the center right press is anti-American until the beginning of the financial crisis. So it is much more interesting. I mean, when we look at Elizabeth Pastis and Avgi, we know what we are waiting, to read. Whereas when we look at the Kapodistrian and Papadimitriou, for instance, who is not he's not a communist, he's not a left-wing journalist, still we see that there are traces of anti-Americanism almost everywhere. Now, there is this puzzle, which is very interesting, what happens in 2008 and the pattern changes. And your comment, Kira, I think it's something that we have to dig on. Maybe it is that the cleavage changes, and what we see is that voters think in a different manner of the United States before and after, because it represents different things. Again, the problem is that how can we know? I mean, with the data, we don't know exactly. It will remain a hypothesis. The far right enters into this analysis only after 2007. So we have less observations in order to infer correlations and results on the far right. We have to go deep into the qualitative analysis there. Very interesting comments as well. I don't know the answer, but we have to think of it. There's a puzzle that is interesting. Maybe in this inverse correlation that you said, maybe, there's always a need for a scapegoat. So either when the United States is unpopular, and this is a scapegoat, maybe there is a need, psychological need, to feel that there is another superpower out there like the EU, that the Greeks can relate with the European Union when things with the United States are wrong, are not going well. Finally, on the hypothesis, I think that the government and opposition thinks that when they are in government, they have to be realistic. And even when Papandreou was in government, he never changed the policy. I mean, there was an anti-American rhetoric in the party manifestos, but this is why, for instance, the problem that we don't have the data from the parliament, it is a problem in the analysis, because if we had it, it could have been that PASOK was positive in parliament as well throughout that period, which is something we cannot test at the moment. But very interesting comments, and thank you very much.
Okay, let's get another quick round so that you get some more feedback because there were some hands. Jonathan.
Yeah, just building a little on what Tim said. You talked about the sort of triangle of EU, US, Greece. I think there was also talk about the triangle of Turkey, Greece, US. And from my own experience, there was also a triangle of Turkey, Greece, EU, which, although it's outside the full remit of this book, is also relevant in terms of the, where the Greek opinion is coming from. So, how do you cope with that? I don't know what you would call it, a quadrangular set of, it's perhaps a tetrahedron.
Question back there, or a comment? Yes.
Questions about international institutions. A couple of mentions, but I wondered about the interaction, the Greek American bilateral interactions at the level of other international institutions. NATO was mentioned, but the other spaces where there's interaction, where there's collaboration and divergence. Thanks.
David.
Thanks so much. David Mann with CSOS. Just to say off on, I very much agree with the point you made. I think there's such a range of anti-American, and the centre of all of them is a basic fallacy. What is the point of being, what's the logic of being anti-American? Since America has a key role to play in all the questions you have a vital interest in.
Allow me,
I was actually planning to ask you.
A little anecdote that might be relevant or not. It's a humorous one. I remember when I interviewed Mitsotakis for another book project, he told me how delighted George Bush was when he visited him in Crete. He presented him with a bottle of very early harvest olive oil, and Bush was delighted about this. And Mitsotakis made it a point to send him the bottle every year. But equally, I remember some of his ministers telling me how embarrassed they were that each time that Mitsotakis went to the United States for UN matters and meeting with officials in the state, he would carry in the official plane that carries the prime minister huge tubs of feta cheese to give as presents to various people in the United States. That's pretty modern. You cannot do that. But in Greece, you can. I thought it was interesting. The issue behind the state visits of that.
I think we should keep in mind what we're talking about really is political anti-Americanism. We're not even touching cultural anti-Americanism. I mean, none of these parties are saying we should get rid of American television, American film, American clothes. That there's a sense in which the junta early on wanted to ban all of that to go back to traditional clothing. That seems to be assumed across the political spectrum. This is much more the US as a kind of symbol over there. And so I think there's a tension in the project where whether this is it bilateral, state-to-state relations, or it's about how anti-Americans, political anti-Americanism is used by competing domestic politics. One party against another party against another interest to settle scores and battle over, a whole range of interests and political ideologies. It's not really about America. It's really much more about the rival particular party. But cultural Americanism seems to have been completely accepted. That doesn't seem to be a point of dispute at this point in the way that it has become one for political issues, state visits, etc. So that's not a given to me. That fact that's played, and even in places like the Soviet Union, there's a kind of openness to American forms, jeans, American music, television. So it's very, very hard to resist that. But they've also kind of given up that anti-Americanism on that level. Well, politically, diplomatically, it's still there. But it seems to be quite similar here. Cultural anti-Americanism is just not there.
Last wise words.
It is even, this is very interesting, but the society, you see that all the culture, the way of life, they embrace Americanism, American values, consumerism, movies, music, etc. But the rhetoric, the public opinion, etc., they are very anti-American. So there's a distinction between the way of life and politics. Now, Turkey definitely plays a role in this relationship. What fuels anti-Americanism and public opinion? I think something that we see in all the interviews, and maybe we have to bring it into the analysis, is that every time, we expect from the United States that they will protect us against Turkey. This is a constant demand and the constant grievance that whatever we give to the United States, we're not protected sufficiently. So maybe this also relates to the insecurities of the public opinion when we are discussing about stances towards the United States. Definitely we have to define the term and what we mean in the book, and it has to cut across all the chapters of the book.
Do we really need to define it? I mean, aren't they supposed to either to say that instances there we're going to actually look at the different kind of anti-Americanism, because it's
That's a definition.
well, what I want to say there's a pluralistic approach to this, which this shouldn't be a bad thing, especially the way we are trying to do it in this book. I mean, as a historian speaking, at least that is the more interesting part, to try to understand through the different kind of events, or either you take in visits or then you move on to specific events, like let's say the issue of terrorism or strategic alignment. You want to see what are the markers of this anti-Americanism. As often I said, Cyprus and Turkey as a triangle becomes important, but that's not the only thing that explains it. In the Iraq War, this is all about the Iraq War and America as an imperialist power. It moves from Greece and Turkey. So suddenly you have a different kind of political interlocution that has to do with America as a superpower, and not in this Greek-Turkish specific regional politics point of view. So it moves around. I think what we haven't done, and we need to look at more at the visits, is the role with EU. And the only one I saw, it was interesting, is that when Dimitri goes to the States in 2002, the Greek press says finally the Greek Prime Minister doesn't care to talk about Greece and Turkey because we are now a European power with the euro. We are ready to go. We don't need them anymore. And they are congratulating the Prime Minister for being so strong. He's not strong. He just has not brought that in. And again, this is not what's happening behind closed doors. So this is what is interesting. This is just what the press is covering. It is not exactly what you hear from interviews that is going on. And in terms of the international institutions, we looked at the visits per se because there were so many other different meetings at the margins of this institution, as you are right, because Greece is a member of all these different fora. And this is where there are actually places at the margins where you socialize and you meet with the leaders. So it's impossible to cover that. And there's, I'm sure, great benefit in trying to see at the margins of those institutional meetings what transpires. But our idea, at least for this presentation, the chapter, was to focus on this kind of high-level visits where especially the media coverage would be quite intense and coherent from the Greek side and the American side. I think what we also would want to say, which is what we were trying to see, is the difference, if we're going to see different coverage in the foreign press and the Greek press. And what we see right now in the visits is that they're complete align. They're reporting exactly what is interesting. Do you know why that is happening? Because the Greek newspapers are reporting what the foreign press is saying. We're recycling what the foreigners are saying about us to ourselves. So it's interesting. You see this kind of way how these ideas secretly work. They reaffirm this kind of different ideas.
Thank you. And we didn't even touch Americanophilia because I think that was in the title, right? So that we didn't discuss. Thank God. That would have been even more complicated, but it was great. Well done on your work. It does provoke a lot of discussion. Thank you very much for being here. I would like to thank Dimitri very much for coming from Manchester to be such a constructive discussion. Paul, very much as always. And well done to the two of you. come back again with very soon with your other projects or the follow-up of this.
What are the projects? The book.
With the book, exactly, with the published book, but it's been terrific having you here. And thank you all for coming. Next week, yes, exactly. We have a special event which is about the German leadership in the new context. So it's happening here at 5 o'clock. Andreas Pusch, one of the speakers, and Timothy Gardner. It's going to be a very topical and very interesting discussion.
That's Tuesday.
Next Tuesday at 5. Thanks, Andreas.
Yes.
I was very intrigued.
A lot of groups on the streets.
I was just imagining